Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over an in-game study. And I think this is one of the most important concepts in all of chess is to understand how to play optimally in the in-game. So you lose less and you win more often. This particular concept we're going to be looking at is called the Reti Endgame. We're going to go over the concept itself, and then we're going to look at some actual games that it took place so you can start to see how it applies to more than just this setup. Now, it's white's move, and white looks like they're all but lost. The white pawn on c6, while it's pretty close to promoting on c8, the black king is close to it, and there's no way that the black king is not going to be able to take this very easily. But you can see the black pawn on h5, it has some separation from the white king. And how is the white king ever going to catch this pawn from promoting to h1? Seems like white is lost. And if we play this out a little bit, you can see if white were to push forward with c7, okay, well now just b7. You can see it's not going to do much. If they come up and promote to a queen, they're just going to lose that queen. If they stop and start pushing the king on h7, well, then they just lose their pawn, and they're never going to be able to catch this black pawn from promoting. So it doesn't work if they just push forward with c7. If they play h7, okay, well, black is just going to play b6, attacking the pawn. And if they try to push forward, well, they're just going to lose the pawn, and they still can't catch this pawn on the h-file. If they don't push forward, maybe they try to attack this pawn. Well, as soon as the white king gets closer, black can just continue to push this pawn down to h1. It seems very difficult that they could ever stop this. If the king doesn't keep pushing, then maybe they play c7. Okay, well, they just lose that pawn, but they're never able to get to this pawn. So how can white actually draw this game and not lose? Well, it all comes down to having multiple threats from the king, and it starts with the move king to g7. Now, let's first look at why this is so important. So the most common play that black could move is king to b6. They don't have to. We'll also look at h4 as well, but let's look at king to b6. Now, white can play the move king to f6. If black takes the pawn on c6, well, you can probably see pretty easily, white can play g5, and now they can stop the pawn from pushing forward. Okay, well, if black doesn't take the pawn on c6, maybe they say, okay, that's not going to work. I need to start pushing my pawn here. If they play h4, white has the move king to e5. And this entire setup is all anchored on the fact that white comes to e5, because now we see the multiple threats that black has to deal with. The first one is if black takes the pawn on c6, well, white can come to f4, and they can stop the pawn from promoting down here. If instead they don't take on c6, what if they come down and play h3? Well, in this case, white can now come to d6. And this is the next critical square that white's coming to. And you can see the threat that white has because they can push forward with c7, and then they can play c8 without worrying about black capturing that pawn. So how does black move from now? They could play a7, and then we could just play d7 and then push up our pawn. Or they could say, well, I'm going to go ahead and promote to a queen. So they play h2, and then we play c7. Okay, well, now queen to, or pawn promoting to h1, but now we get our own queen. So in this position, we have been able to actually stabilize, and this is going to be a drawn game. Now, if we come back, we looked at what happens if after we come to e5, if they play h3, we're just going to push forward with that c7. But what if instead they decide, yeah, we're just going to take that pawn on c6? We already looked at, we play f4, and we're going to capture that pawn. So it all comes back to originally, instead of playing c7, instead of playing h7, it all comes to the g7 square because we're threatening coming to f6 and then e5 so that we have two threats. One of coming to d6, helping this c6 pawn, as well as preparing to come over and attack the pawn on the h-file. Black has to figure out which side they want to deal with. but at the end of the day, they are left with a draw. So subtle moves, white's saying, yeah, I can get to two different places using a different path, same number of moves, but a different path. So that's the concept. We're going to start looking at this in some actual games. So this is the next variation. Take a minute, pause, and see if you can come up with black's best move. Now, the best move for black is to play king to b2. But let's first look at some of the alternatives and why they won't work. Now, we have the pawn on a4. We're trying to come down to a1, and white on f2, they can first move with pawn. You can always move two squares. They're coming to f4, and then they're going to push up to f8. If we try to immediately come to a3, well, that's not going to work because then they just capture our pawn, and then we start trying to catch up to this f pawn, and we never can. So that doesn't work. If we try to immediately chase this pawn on f2, we play c2, they play f4. We try to catch it with d3, but they push forward, and you can see we're never going to catch that pawn. So let's say we change course and play a3. Okay, well, they're just going to capture the pawn. That's not going to work. So if we try to commit to either side, neither of those are the best option. The best option is to have a dual threat, and that happens to be king to b2. Now we have to look at why is that the best option? Well, now white has to decide. Do they want to take the pawn or do they want to push forward? If they take the pawn, well, now we can actually catch this pawn on the f file. They play f4, we play d4, and you can see we are going to capture that pawn because we made them commit. We had a dual threat with our king. If they don't take the pawn, if they start pushing with f4, well, not only is it not a draw, and not only are we not going to lose, but we are going to win this game because now we have the dual threat of a3. They can't take our pawn anymore. That's why king to b2 is so powerful, because it threatens the move of a3. So they can't take. So if they start pushing up, we are going to win this race. And so after we play a1, promote to a queen, they play f7. We play queen f1, and we are going to take this pawn, and we are going to end up winning the game. So it all comes back to the very beginning, where should black move? They should play king b2. This is the last variation we're going to look at. It's white's move, and see if you can pause and figure out white's best move. Now, the best move for white to draw this game is to play king g6. But first, let's look at why that is the case by looking at some of the other alternatives. Now, if you look at king f6, it may look like this king is actually in between both of the pawn structures, and so this is a better move. Unfortunately, though, the king needs to have multiple threats, and this king is actually getting away from this pawn on h4. To protect this pawn, it really needs to stay on the g file. This is almost committing to this pawn structure or stopping these pawns on the queen side of the board. So from here, black could play pawn c4. We take, they take. Now we can start to bring our king involved into the action, but it's too late. They play c3. We take their pawn, and then after a4, we're not able to actually make up any ground, and we can't stop their pawn from pushing forward and promoting to the queen on a1. So that's not going to work. Just playing king to f6, it's actually doing too much harm because it's committing to the queen side of the board. Now instead, what if we just played h5? Okay, well now they take on h5. We're still going to play that king to f6, and we've already looked at before, we're not able to catch the pawn structure over here. Now, why is king to g6 any different? Well, the reason is because we have multiple threats here. What if now they take on h4? Well, now we can play king to f5, a square that our king has not been at so far before. Now, if they continue with their c4, they take. Now we play king e4. Remember, before it was on king e5. And so now if they play c3, we capture, and they play a4, we can easily make it down and stop the pawn coming to a1. Now, if we come back after we play g6, what if they don't capture with their king? What if they decide to go ahead and commit to the queen side of the board? They play c4. Well, now we have the move h5, and this is the reason that g6 is so much better, because it stops not only the threat on the queen side, but it also supports this h-pawn from pushing up the board. So now they may recognize the king can't do anything to this pawn. This pawn is passed and it is moving up the board. You can't stop it. So now if they try to commit to the queen side of the board, we can capture, but we have the pawn on h6, and we are going to beat them to promoting. We are going to be okay, and this is going to be a drawn game. Remember, in this initial position, black should be winning if you just look at the board state. The king is about to take the pawn on h4, and they have 3 pawns to double pawns on the b file. It's very difficult if you just look at this at face value to think that white can actually bring out a draw. Remember, all we're trying to do is get a draw from white's standpoint. So as long as we play king to g6, doesn't matter where black plays, we're going to draw this game. But if we don't play king to g6, if we play king to f6 or anything else, black playing correctly is going to have an easy victory. So hopefully this Reti Endgame study helps you as you approach your own endgames, especially with king and pawns, which is what we're studying right now, to think about having your king have multiple threats to put your opponent in a position where they can't take advantage of maybe a position where they think they are going to win. If you did watch this entire video, would love in the comments below to put 100. Every now and then I'll like to see who made it to the very end of the video. That lets me know that you did make it through. Also would like to know in the comments if you got either of the lessons. That lets me know that I did a good job of teaching the concept. So if you were able to get the first or second correct moves, hopefully you did, please let me know in the comments section below. If there's other tactics that you want me to focus on, if you like in-game strategy, let me know that. Or if you just want middle game or opening, I can do that as well. But thank you guys so much for watching the video. I'll see you guys in the next one.